Most of us are not in the craft very long when we start to become aware of the large number of anti-Masonic statements which are constantly circulating. These statements invariably have two things in common. One, they come from somebody who has little or no real knowledge of or exposure to the craft and its workings. And two, they are always attributed to a reliable source and someone who really knows.
Good evening and welcome to tonight's presentation, From the Quarries, an archive of Masonic lore.
My own personal experiences began shortly after my initiation, when I was congratulated by a non-Masonic employee who, at the same time, informed me that he had it from a very reliable source that it was impossible to get into business unless you were a Freemason. The English wife of a good friend told me that after an accident sustained whilst driving in England, she had been charged with a motoring offence and, though innocent, had been convicted because the driver of the other vehicle was a Freemason and the magistrate was also one. Doubtless all members who have belonged to the craft for any length of time will have had similar experiences. These examples, however, are mere word-of-mouth hearsay, which in many cases evoke only amusement from most of their listeners, both within and outside the craft. Of a far more serious nature are anti-Masonic statements which are given the stamp of authenticity because they are made by those who hold responsible positions. These statements are reported in otherwise reputable news media, which the non-discerning public does not normally question. It must be acknowledged that, to the majority of the public, news media statements, either in printed or broadcast form, are accepted without question and recapitulated with the thought that it must be true. I read it in the paper, or I heard it on the TV. In these days of mass communication, where news media are reaching a public of unprecedented size, when sensationalism and the marketing of the product is of greater importance than the veracity of the content, and where, to paraphrase an oft-quoted statement, only the facts have been changed to make a good story, we are facing a growing flood of anti-Masonic propaganda. There are few ills in our world today, the cause of which Masonic detractors do not lay at the door of the craft. In 1978, I attended an evangelist meeting at Tokoroa. A hellfire and brimstone preacher had promised to reveal the hidden evils of Freemasonry. We were bitterly disappointed, and about the only concrete fact with which we were enlightened was his unequivocal statement that Freemasons controlled world economics, and, more particularly, the United States Treasury. As sole proof thereof, he offered the example of the US $1 bill, on the back of which is depicted both sides of the Great Seal of the United States. The obverse of this seal is, of course, the familiar bald eagle with outstretched wings, arrows in one claw, and an olive branch in the other. The reverse is less well known, and the only place that this appears is on the back of the $1 bill. It depicts an unfinished pyramid with 13 rows of stones, portraying the Union, being watched over by the all-seeing eye of God, which is contained within a triangle. This symbol, he assured us, was proof positive of Masonic control of the US monetary system. Earlier this year, we were treated to a newspaper report of a recently published book by Stephen Knight, which claims to document and prove the subversive activities and the potential dangers of the craft. This was featured in the Wellington Evening Post under the arresting headline, "Freemasonry Used for Soviet Spying Author," and in the Auckland Star under the equally eye-catching Freemasonry Claimed KGB Stronghold. In the column Nutshells in the New Zealand Herald, there appeared a quote from a statement made by the Iranian Minister of Islamic Guidance, Ayatollah Douai, that the press is the most dangerous arm in the contemporary world. Freedom of the press is an invention of Jews, Freemasons, and colonialists as a means of sowing dissension among the disinherited. Much of this type of anti-Masonic propaganda bears a similar hallmark, the fixation of the concept that Freemasonry is, in fact, a worldwide conspiracy, bent on total behind-the-scenes control for its own ends. Whence comes this insidious myth, this portrayal of Freemasonry as a gigantic octopus moving with unseen malevolence through the corridors of power, manipulating and scheming and forever growing? For the answer to this question, we must go back to the late 18th century. In 1797, a French Jesuit, the Abbé Barruel, wrote in a monumental opus of 5 volumes that the French Revolution was the carefully orchestrated fulfillment of an ancient conspiracy of what he considered the most secret of all secret societies. Barruel claimed that the medieval order of Templars, a surviving relic of the Crusades, had not really been successfully abolished by papal decree in 1312, but had survived as a clandestine organization, preaching unrestricted liberty to all people, dedicated to the overthrow of all monarchies and the papacy, and to the foundation of a world republic controlled by the Templars themselves. He further postulated that, since that time, it had, in the implementation of that policy, been responsible for a large number of political assassinations and, in the 18th century, had taken over control of the Order of Freemasons. It had, according to Barruel, established in 1763 a secret literary academy, among whose members were such free-thinking liberals as Turgot, Voltaire, and Robespierre. These men, meeting in the house of Baron d'Holbach, published tracts and pamphlets which had, he claimed, resulted in the deterioration of morality and religion among the French. It had, furthermore, from 1776, created a gigantic revolutionary organization involving 500,000 Frenchmen who were the Jacobins of the Revolution. At the center of the conspiracy were the Bavarian Illuminati, led by Adam Weishaupt, whom Barruel describes as enemies of the human race, sons of Satan. All the Freemasons and Jacobins in France, he claimed, already owed complete, blind obedience to that small band of Germans, who, he felt would, unless stopped, completely control the world. Barruel's claim that the French Revolution was the result of a conspiracy dating back to the 14th century is so fanciful as to be unworthy of any effort of rebuttal. As regards that little-known German group called the Illuminati, they were in fact rivals of the Freemasons and had been dissolved in 1786, 3 years prior to the French Revolution. He had greatly oversimplified and exaggerated the role of the Freemasons. Without doubt, they were numbered among those whose concern for humanitarian reform assisted in creating the climate leading to the revolution. They had already contributed to the abolition of witchcraft trials and of judicial torture. On the other hand, most French Freemasons were monarchist. Louis XVI and his brothers were all Freemasons. And, during the mass executions which followed the revolution, Freemasons were guillotined by the hundred, and their order, the Grand Orient, was suppressed. Barruel's work, in its original, uninspiring, and clearly erroneous form, would doubtless not long have survived the death of its author in 1820, and would have vanished into richly merited obscurity. It was prevented from doing so by the mischance which associated it with another, equally scurrilous, and equally false defamatory fabrication of a sick mind. I refer to the infamous Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The scope and time available for this paper simply does not permit a detailed discussion of the origins and evolution of this work. In brief, they consist of a rabidly anti-Semitic document purporting to be the blueprint for a Jewish plot to take over the world. The earliest traceable source of this myth is contained in a letter received by Barrowell from Florence in 1806. This was ostensibly written by an army officer, one J.B. Simonini, of whom nothing else is known, and with whom even Barrowell himself failed to establish contact. This letter appears to be the first in a line of anti-Semitic forgeries which were to culminate in the Protocols. In it, the author commences by first congratulating Barrowell on having unmasked the hellish sects which are preparing the way for the Antichrist, and then goes on to draw Barrowell's attention to Judaic wealth and the protection it enjoys in almost all European countries. The mysterious Simonini permits his imagination to run riot. He claims to have penetrated to the centre of a Jewish conspiracy and to have discovered that, amongst other things, the founders of Freemasonry and of the Illuminati were both Jews, although the founders of both are well known and neither was founded by Jews. That in Italy alone over 800 ecclesiastics were Jews, and ranked among their number were bishops and cardinals, and would shortly include a pope. All of this is, of course, self-evidently spurious. At the time of the Simonini letter, many lodges were still practicing a ritual highly Christian in character, and many others were still reluctant to accept Jewish members. Jews, or persons of Jewish descent, have never occupied a disproportionate place in Freemasonry. These are established facts. But, nevertheless, the basis of the myth of the Judeo-Masonic conspiracy was born. Barrowell had shown, at least to his own satisfaction, that the French Revolution was the result of a conspiracy of Freemasons. The increasing freedom from discrimination against religious minorities which followed the Revolution was clearly to the advantage of the Jews. No further evidence was required to demonstrate to these somewhat less than unbiased critics that Freemasons and Jews were closely associated in a worldwide Judeo-Masonic conspiracy. The twisted logic of the combination of Barrowell's imagination and the Simonini letter aroused little public interest in the first half of the 19th century, until in the 1860s, Hermann Goetsche, a discredited former employee of the Russian Postal Service, who had been sacked for forgery, commenced writing novels under the pseudonym of Sir John Ratcliffe. In one of these novels, Biarritz, an eerie scene in the macabre style of Edgar Allan Poe is recounted. Set in a Jewish cemetery in Prague, the scene portrays how, at midnight on the Feast of Tabernacles, representatives of the 12 tribes of Israel hold conversation with the satanic presence emanating from a tomb. These representatives report on the progress they have made towards fulfillment of the aims of their conspiracy for world domination. The novel Biarritz was published in 1868, in the anti-Semitic climate existing in Germany after a partial emancipation of the Jews. This is merely the start of the saga. At this point, we are discussing a novel, a work of fiction only. Soon, however, this clearly fictional chapter, taken out of the framework of the novel, begins to turn into a forged document. Russian anti-Semites published the relevant chapter in 1872 in St. Petersburg in the form of a pamphlet, which, although bearing the comment that it was a work of fiction, stated that it had a basis in fact. In 1876, it appeared in a similar publication in Moscow under the title In the Jewish Cemetery in Czech Prague, The Jews, Sovereigns of the World. In 1880, a second edition was issued, and similar items appeared in Odessa and Prague. In 1881, it arrived in France, printed in Le Contemporain. At this point, no reference is made to it being a work of fiction. It has now become established fact. All the speeches supposedly made by the 12 representatives in the cemetery in Prague were combined into a single speech, ostensibly made by a chief rabbi to a secret meeting of Jews. The authenticity of the speech is vouched for by an imaginary English diplomat. After all, who would dare doubt the word of an Englishman? And indeed is claimed as an extract from his protected book. Goethe had originally written in his novel, from which this work had been extracted, under the pseudonym of Sir John Ratcliffe. Perhaps not surprisingly, for the English diplomat is given the name of Sir John Redcliffe. When, in 1896, François Bounon printed the so-called speech in his work, it is attributed to the chief rabbi John Redcliffe. Further editions followed and found fertile ground in the superstitiously gullible minds of a populace not far removed from a generally accepted belief in witchcraft, werewolves, and sorcery. Its many translations spread throughout Europe under a variety of titles, including one which appeared in 1906 with the title Extracts from the Protocols of the Freemasons. Although the protocols themselves, in the standard version, are only 24 in number and contain only passing reference to Freemasonry, they are invariably published with a commentary proving and justifying their veracity. The two English editions each comprise about 100 small pages. These Freemasonic references, albeit small, when conjoined in the reader's mind by the anti-Masonic pronouncements included in the commentaries, are sufficient to create the implications of a great Judeo-Masonic conspiracy. One such example will suffice. Where Murin, in his version entitled The French Masons' Synagogue of Satan, said,
"Everything in Freemasonry is fundamentally Jewish, exclusively Jewish, passionately Jewish from the beginning to the end. The fact that all revolutions are made in the depths of the Masonic Black Lodges would be inexplicable if we did not know that the ministries of all countries are in the hands of Freemasons who, in the last analysis, are controlled by Jews."
Murin has further facts to reveal about these black lodges. They consist of Freemasonries and Jews of the 33rd degree. The protocols themselves end with the words, "Signed by the representatives of Zion of the 33rd degree." This allusion to the ancient and accepted Scottish rite is clear. This particular Freemasonic system, which originated in the US in 1801 and thence spread with great rapidity to many countries, has, as its highest rank, the title of Sovereign Grand Inspector General, which is, in fact, the 33rd degree of that order of Freemasonry. We, as citizens of a liberal democracy, which has, for some generations, prided itself on the quality and universality of its educational system, are hard put to comprehend the impact these doctrines could have had on superstitious, largely illiterate populations. It must be emphasized that these publications were not merely a solitary outburst by a few sensation-seeking individuals. They were published in literally hundreds of editions, translated into scores of languages: Russian, German, Polish, French, Romanian, Czech, Yugoslav, Greek, Italian, Portuguese, Dutch, Swedish, Norwegian, and of course English, to name a few. A generation ago, one author, Henry Rollin, reckoned that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, in all its various forms, was probably the most widely distributed book in the world after the volume of the Sacred Law. It has served as the justification of most of the anti-Semitic and anti-Masonic steps taken by totalitarian governments in the last 150 or so years, culminating, of course, in the well-documented excesses of one Adolf Hitler towards both Freemasons and Jews. The evil potential of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion should never be underestimated. For a deep dive into the history, philosophy, and traditions of Freemasonry, subscribe to From the Quarries. You will find hundreds of lectures, presentations, shorts, and other Masonic works written by Freemasons for Freemasons. Visit FromTheQuarries.com or YouTube at From the Quarries.